Good afternoon, everybody. My name's Toby Fyfe, and you can see Kate Moran, who has joined us from beautiful British Columbia. Now, welcome to the Institute on Governance Leading Through COVID-19 series. I will introduce Kate more formally in just a minute. Just to remind you that this is a Thursday afternoon series we are doing aimed at public service leaders so that they can learn more about what it's like to lead through a crisis from people who've actually had to do so. Now, typically, we invite you to send in your comments and the like and questions if you have any through YouTube. We're having a bit of trouble with YouTube at the moment, so we're just going to be doing this as a webcast. We will be recording it though, so you will be able to see it once we complete the interview. But unfortunately, I won't be able to take questions during the broadcast. So Kate Moran is the President and CEO of Oceans Networks Canada, and why we've invited her to join us today is that she was involved in the Deepwater Horizon crisis. So Kate, thank you very, very much for joining us. I appreciate you taking the time.
I'm happy to do so. Thanks for inviting me, Tom.
So my first question relates to when you actually heard about the Deepwater Horizon and the crisis that it happened. And this, of course, was the explosion in the Gulf. Where were you and what were your responsibilities at the time?
Well, I was working as an assistant director in the Office of Science and Technology Policy, which is part of the Executive Office of the President of the United States, and the president at the time was Obama. And I heard about it on the news. It was really the blowout and explosion was on the news. That was on April 20th, just about 10 years ago now. And then the train wreck that was going on somewhat slowly over a few days started to accelerate when the actual rig sank 2 days later on, ironically, Earth Day. And then the industry went to actually look at the wellhead, and it saw that it was spewing oil into the Gulf of Mexico at incredible rates. So it was towards the end of that week when our office started to become engaged. And the way this office works is my portfolios were Arctic, Polar and Arctic, and the ocean, but we're all hands on deck during crises in that office to provide as much guidance through the president's science advisor to the president. So I immediately began to send content up the chain. We used to call them content-packed paragraphs. And it was clear that I had experience in ocean drilling. So one of the paragraphs I sent up was one that said the second attempt that BP was trying to shut down the well was going to fail because of the formation of hydrates, and everyone took notice. And so I became part of, at the time, was a team led by Secretary of Energy Chu. As an 8-person team, our team was formed to provide advice and guidance to the incident commander, the head of the Coast Guard, on what they could or couldn't do with BP to shut down the well. And this was very interesting because it was really the president, John Holdren, who was a science advisor at the time, told me that it was in the Oval Office when the president instructed Thad Allen, the incident commander, that he should not make any decisions about how to technically shut down the well without talking to Nobel laureate physicist Stephen Chu. So that's how it all began. And the reality of it hit me when I realized I was doing my ocean work. I was in a tea shop near the White House, and my BlackBerry rang and said, "You got to come to the Situation Room." And that's when it all became, yes, all hands on deck. And I became intimately involved with that part of the work, which was trying to stop the flow of oil into the Gulf of Mexico.
And what exactly was the role of the federal government in dealing with the multiple players? Because obviously there was the private sector, but also the Gulf states.
Yeah, well, this is what the simple part about this was in federal waters. So it was a federal responsibility. If the incident command system was invoked, there was clear authority in terms of industry has to work directly with the incident commander across a whole bunch of aspects of it, stopping the well, which was very unusual. This was new and different. This wasn't like a normal oil spill. So there was this whole piece of technology, and that's why the president got Stephen Chu involved. It's that there's this piece that's not just normal Coast Guard overseeing the cleanup of a a tanker or something like that. And so that was relatively easy because it was a federal responsibility, and then there was multiple departments that had to be working on that. In the office I worked in, it's one of the unique aspects of the United States government that I think has a lot of value, and that is it's there to coordinate in an interagency basis. And so because of that office already working in that way, the machinery of interagency work was already in place. We just had to grease the wheels to make it work even better. So it was that part of it was relatively seamless. The state part of it was on when the oil hit the state waters, and that's when it got complicated. Because, and I wasn't working on that part, but I kept in touch with it. But the reality was that it was like COVID. It was not only the fact that there was issues associated with the environment, but it was health issues, jobs. So all of that became a very complicated piece, and each state was quite different because of the different economic aspects of each of the states. Texas very different from Mississippi, for example. But I was working on the big problem. Let's get this oil from stopping this oil from going into the Gulf of Mexico.
So two directions I might go. Let me start with the first one, which is internal. So you mentioned that the procedures and the like were in place for interagency cooperation. Is that typical, or had there been some sense that, government needed to prepare in this case, and so everyone was going to be on, I don't know, gray alert versus red alert, if you know what I mean?
Well, this serendipitously, but it was also because of President Obama's leadership. I came in, and the portfolios I was working on were Arctic and Ocean. I worked together with another person in the office on the Ocean portfolio. And so this happened pretty well in the middle of our work on the Ocean portfolio. And that was to develop a national ocean policy. So we had already greased the wheels. We had been working with 22 different departments to bring them together to develop this policy. So we knew each other, we had talked regularly, we had meetings. So it was somewhat, not lucky, because it came from the leadership of the top. The president said, let's do this. But it prepared the federal government for this response in a really important way. It took us a while. So if we hadn't started that, all that work of communication, understanding each other, who's the leadership, where are the roadblocks, we would have been really, really delayed if that machinery hadn't been already in place because of our work on the ocean policy.
So the other path I'd like to go down is one where you reference how you had to work with the states when the oil, of course, started to come on shore. And one gets the impression south of the border now with the COVID is that it's been politicized, that I don't want to go down too far down that rabbit hole. I guess my question to you is, did you face those kind of challenges, or was there good collaboration and cooperation between the states and the federal government?
Yeah, I wasn't totally that close to this file, but it seemed like there was good cooperation during the crisis. The cooperation became less so when the allocation of resources were happening. And I've been learning about that since, because I've been on the U.S. National Academy of Science advisory group who's been looking at some of these monies that get distributed. So it's a competition, who gets the money, what sectors do we help the Vietnamese fishers, those kinds of discussions were, I'm assuming, because I wasn't firsthand involved, were harder because you were distributing resources to help these coastal communities get back on their feet. But I'll say that, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
Yes, so one of the things that was used, so there's a good distribution of regional federal pieces in the United States, and they sit with organizations like the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, which has sea grant organizations that sit between science and communities, like fishers or coastal cleanup. And so they were instrumental in helping those kind of discussions happen. So that was a tool that was already in place. There was already a distributed network of federal engagement that has been going on for years.
So that's very interesting, because that would speak to getting the civil society engaged, right? Moving this beyond just organizations to engaging fishers and others in the community. Would that be a fair way of putting it?
Absolutely, and that's what was happening. And so, through organizations like Sea Grant and other parts of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, those, I'll say, relationships are already developed. They're very mature in terms. They're not perfect, but they're there. So they're there, and people know who's who in the zoo in terms of responsibilities in communities and cities and coastal management issues.
You were part of that leadership group, as you mentioned. How priorities must have been changing by the minute. Were there processes and procedures set up to deal with that? How did you guys do that?
Well, I never thought I would have spent so much time in the Situation Room, but we use it. I mean, the Situation Room is for that purpose. You meet there. It's a small room, really, with no, you have to leave your devices outside, but almost on a daily or every other day basis, there'd be meetings there in terms of issues that arose. But for the team that I worked on with Secretary Chu, he's a pretty amazing guy. I just have to say that humbly that every time I was in a room with him and many people, he was the smartest guy in the room, for sure, asking the right questions and helping with decision making. But what he did was he set up a conference call system that was just for this purpose, for this 8-member team. And so it was an amazing number. You just dialed a number, no code, and there you were talking to Secretary Chu. We talked, I would say, 5 times a day. And we would bring in different people addressing different questions, and it was stressful. I mean, because we were trying to get BP to do the right thing, and they brought in incredible technology. There's no question. They put they put all the technology out there as fast as possible. But I'll just give you one example where. That the different roles of these groups clashed. So it took a while for us to finally come up with BP and us to come up with a way to cap the well, which we did in July. But the concern was that it could build up pressure in the drill string and cause a leak that could happen from the side of the drill string and come up another location, and then it would have been totally out of control, because that's kind of that's a dangerous situation. And so we wanted BP to monitor it in real time so that we could assess how it was doing and to make sure that there were no leaks coming out of the wellhead. And so we instructed them through work some of which I did, to use some of the technology that had been developed in the US government using acoustics to detect bubbles. And when we deployed it the first day, we detected bubbles. And we immediately got on the call and said, there are bubbles coming out of this. And the BP response was like, we have to keep this secret because of shareholders. I mean, they didn't say it that explicitly, but that was their driver, right? So we had to kind of figure out how to work around that to make sure that we don't have another accident because of the fact that shareholders are worried about stock prices. So that was a big learning curve for me. How do we manage that? But we got through it. We learned what the bubbles were and managed it, and it was not an issue, thank goodness, and we moved on. But the different cultures in terms of priorities there, for sure.
And was there the need for a heavy hand on occasion, or this type of occasion from the federal government, or were you really very much focused on a collaborative approach?
It was more collaborative, but there was some very firm. These are mostly happening on calls. Sometimes we go down to Houston, so it was pretty collaborative. But the Secretary Chu and this 8-member team, which had, I think, a couple other Nobel laureates on it, were pretty firm about things, and so no one was shy about saying, we need to be doing this or that. So,
can you elaborate a bit on the impact that your success in reaching out to civil society, the fishers and the like, did that have an impact on how people responded to the crisis? In terms of, it's this notion of sort of not political, but citizen support for the tough decisions that are being made. I frame it because in the COVID crisis, at least in Canada, it's been quite fascinating how, broadly speaking, citizens have, got behind governments in taking care of their health through social distancing and the like. I'm just curious whether this was an issue in that crisis, and if so, how it played out.
Well, I think there was a lot of disparities, and this is just anecdotally for me because, as I said, I wasn't really focused on this file, but I'll just give you an example. So 10 years later, I just mentioned I was on this National Academy of Science Advisory Board, using funds that were allocated from the accident. And today, the research priorities are associated with helping the communities impacted by the Deepwater Horizon get back on their feet today, health-wise, economically. So, and that's so that this whole National Academy's funding is really associated with research on health, social issues, and some of the natural sciences, but it's really focused on health and economic issues that have impacted that coastline dramatically. So I don't have the direct knowledge. I know that in the meetings I was in, the federal government was fully engaged to try to get to speak with the public and speak with decision makers and try to understand issues and provide testing. Everyone was concerned about testing fish and trying to get that information to the public so people would be feel safe buying seafood and eating it. So that was a big concern. I don't know how successful it was at the time. I know it was a problem for sure at the time.
I've talked to a number of federal leaders who have been leading through this crisis, and one thing they have commented on is how amazingly impressed they have been with their public service colleagues, the people in the organization who have just stepped up to the plate and in fact are sort of calling up and saying, what can I do to help? Did you face that kind of impact, or again, were you more of such a small unit it didn't really apply?
It was huge. It was, so right away, we had been working on this ocean policy with 22 departments. It was, everybody came to the table. What can we do? How can we use our technology? And so the other thing that we did in our office, myself and my colleague, it was in May, early May, and I can't remember the exact date, but it was like a Thursday. We sent out a notice to every oceanographic institution in the United States to come to Washington the following Monday or Tuesday, I forget which it was, to bring any technology they could do. So this was a short notice, 2 to 3 days. There were several hundred people that came, and we organized them in the big central meeting room in the Environmental Protection Agency, and they brought important technology. So we then engaged another sector of society to help. And some of those technologies were really critical to not only stopping the flow of oil, but then understanding where the oil went, how much oil came out, all those kinds of things. So for me, that's something that I think it is happening here. We're seeing the chief scientists engage with the team. I'm guessing that the federal departments are doing the same, but it's amazing what you can bring to the table when you really engage people who are keen to help solve the problem. It happened then. It was fantastic, really. It was really fantastic. I'll give you an anecdote. So in the office, I got the science advisor got a letter from 2 prisoners in a state penitentiary in Pennsylvania. And I got it because I was working on this file. They sent their solution for how to stop the flow of oil. And it was beautiful. They had cut out pictures from the newspaper and drew these systems. So it was even the prisoners in the country wanted to help solve the problem. I still have that letter. It's hysterical. I mean, it was heartfelt, but it was really wonderful.
You're now president and CEO of Ocean Network Canada and Europe. Explain to us how you're using data to drive evidence-based decision-making to avoid or to be ready for similar types of incidents that might happen.
Right, we're doing several things. We have sensors on the ocean that were enhanced by work from Natural Resources Canada and Fisheries and Oceans Canada, and we measure tsunami waves on the West Coast. And that data goes into the Pacific Tsunami Warning System. So that's kind of a system that's already in place. But we also take data that is about tsunami waves, combine it with other data, and we provide inundation information to local communities. So, for example, Port Alberni, some of you probably don't know where that is, but it's on the West Coast at high risk for tsunamis. We've been able to provide them with inundation information should a tsunami happen, and they are using that to plan, where does the cash go, or what roads do we close, those kind of things. So that's a direct impact on the community. We also have been building with Natural Resources Canada in partnership and Environment Emergency Management British Columbia, the first earthquake early warning system in Canada. And that is a partnership we're doing with these departments, but again, that is, you're taking data, combining with algorithms, and because of the nature of earthquakes, we're able to give a minute, maybe a minute and a half of time of alerting before ground shaking may happen in your location. And I know that the federal government through Natural Resources Canada is hoping to, or is planning to install that kind of system even in places like in Ottawa, which is the second seismically risk area. So those are a couple of examples of what we are doing in terms of providing information that is really for public safety. We also provide data directly to the port for information about the characteristics of ocean currents in areas where they're concerned, the pilots are concerned about bringing large vessels in. So that information directly informs them about when they can bring ships in to avoid any kind of impact. And in the Arctic, we measure sea ice thickness in the community of Cambridge Bay, and that's information that's useful for the town so that they know if the ice is safe for them to travel over. Sometimes they want to take their snow machines and take a shortcut to the airport, or just to go out and hunt and fulfill their livelihood on the ice. So those are a few examples of what we do.
But had any of this technology-based data been available in times of the Deepwater Horizon, could it have made a difference, do you think, or not really?
The data that Ocean Networks Canada provides?
Well, the kind of data that it does for a crisis like Deepwater.
Yeah, so one of the big issues with the Deepwater Horizon, even though the Gulf of Mexico has been studied for many years, the long-term observation of what's there was not compiled. And so what Ocean Networks Canada does, we have real-time observatories now. Now next year we'll be celebrating our 15th year. So we have this long-term knowledge of the baseline or benchmark of the ocean before an event. That didn't really occur. So so what happened was, how do you measure the fine? How do you develop the costs for this damage? When you don't have a benchmark and a baseline, it becomes very, very subjective. So an observation system like we have here on the West Coast, and we're partnering with others on the East Coast to expand, really are important for having that scientific knowledge of where we were before the incident and where we're going to be after it. So it's critically important, and that just wasn't in place in the Gulf of Mexico.
Listen, thank you so much for that. Can you, perhaps before I let you go, give us your lessons or takeaways that you took from this experience, and what you would want leaders to think about in the public service as they work through today's crisis?
Yeah, well, I think the first thing was that working with Secretary Chu and this team, he brought in people from the government, from his own, from the Department of Energy, who were tremendously experts, but then he drew from other sectors, particularly the academic sector. And so I think it's reaching out to others outside of your own federal family, I think is really crucial, because you bring in other knowledge and other perspectives, and other questions get asked and answered. I think the second thing would be that, as I mentioned, it's important to have pre-established, and in the US they call them interagency, but an interdepartmental machinery in place already, so that when a crisis happens, you don't have to get it up and running again. So it might be useful to take a look at this after it's over to see what other kinds of ways can the federal government ensure that that interdepartmental machinery is in place, because it's establishing new coordination across departments takes a lot of effort. The third thing is I think it's important to document the policy I'll call them roadblocks, as you fight through this crisis, because then you have the ability to then make change in the future, or if you can on the fly. I mean, I'm impressed with this federal government's amazing policy agility during this COVID time. But documenting those policy roadblocks or issues will help then in the future in terms of developing future policy. And I was doing that from the start, and I wasn't successful at what the changes I wanted to make, but I still have them documented. So if I ever get back there, I hope to do that. I think it's also important to ensure that your decision-making goes up. I mean, decision-making sits at the bureaucratic level all the time, but we were finding it very important that both the president, the science advisor, Secretary Chu always knew everything that we were making decisions on. And that was not, that went back both ways, and it really strengthened not only our work, but it allowed us to have more freedom. And then as I mentioned at the start, engage all your assets and don't silo them. And then finally, just catch up on sleep later.
Kate Moran, thank you so much for sharing your experience and your insights from this episode. I much appreciate it, and thank you again. Very kind of you to take the time.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
Just to remind you, I have to thank SAS, who has been a sponsor of this series. We will be back next week at 11:30 on next Thursday, where we're going to be speaking to James Baxter, who's a former publisher of iPolitics, about what you need to think about as a public servant in dealing with the media. Now, this is part of the Institute on Governance response to supporting government through this crisis. So a couple of things I'd like to draw your attention to other than this series. The first is that we have now moved all of our programs and courses online and created in interactive webinars, so that professional development can continue through this period. We now have our program up until the end of August, so I really encourage you to have a look at how you might be able to use it either for yourself or for your team to make maximum use of this period. The other thing I have to tell you about is next week on Tuesday, we are going to be doing another one of our policy crunches. These are our monthly series where we would bring together people from across the government to talk about issues. We used to do it in our facility at 60 George Street, and now, of course, we are doing it online using Zoom and YouTube. Our topic next week is going to be on the future of energy coming out of this crisis. And just let me give you a sense of some of the guests who are going to be there. Dr. Monica Gattinger, who's the director of the Ottawa U's Institute for Science, Society, and Policy. Serge Dupont, former deputy, who many of you will know, who's senior advisor of Bennett Jones, and also served at PCO for a senior executive advisor on the TMX project. Scott Vaughan, international chief advisor to the China Council for International Cooperation on the Environment and Development, and an IISD senior fellow. You won't want to miss this. It's at 5:30 on Tuesday. So be sure to go onto our website, register for this, and log on. Once again, thank you so much, and we'll see you again next week.